in wildlife, a diploma in territory planning, also a diploma in human rights and international rights and international humanitarian rights, and he has been the director in the northwest of Colombia for 24 years, and in that group we have Gisela Paredes as well. She's a zootechnician and she holds an MSc in rural development, a master's degree in sciences from sustainability to manage global change, and she's a member of the World Commission of Protected Areas and the Cross-Border Conservation Panel. She's also a specialized professional in national parks. And also in this group, we have Natalia Jimenez. She's an attorney with studies in international relations and environmental law. She has almost 12 years experience, 12 year experience in the analysis, political and legal analysis on human rights in different countries in Latin America. And finally, last speaker is Kimberly Valencia Cardona and Valentina Arango Rincon. Kimberly is an anthropologist from Antioquia University with emphasis on rurality and farmers or peasants, social and water conflicts, and gender conflicts. She holds experience in providing support to peasant farm processes, community action boards, collectivities of women, and project formulation to encourage social political participation of women, as well as the defense of human rights and the territory. Valentina is an anthropologist from Antioquia University as well. She works with topics related to women, the armed conflict, and social cultural conflicts. She has experience in projects related to gender, environment, security, and sovereignty, and food security, access to utilities, armed conflict, and post-conflict. All our panelists have about 15 minutes, a little bit more could be, and then we will have a QA session. Thank you. Simon, the floor is yours.
Perfect. So, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So, thank you for the introduction, Christine, and good morning, everybody. Today, my colleague, Sebastián Gómez and I, Simón Ladino Cano, will be presenting our initial research entitled Sustainability Challenges in Colombia's Transition Peace, Lessons on Deforestation in the Northwestern Amazon. I will present first our paper in English, and afterwards, during the discussion round, Sebastián will answer all your questions and provide further information in Spanish. So, to begin with, our research seeks to answer the following questions. First, which are the main drivers and actors of deforestation in the Northwestern Amazon after 2016? And second, how can forest governance be improved in order to foster the peace-building process in Colombia? Looking forward to answer these questions, our presentation will be divided into the following 5 sections. First, the importance of the Northwestern Amazon. Second, the recent trends in deforestation. Third, main drivers of deforestation. 4, changes in the roles of the actors, of the key actors. And 5, some policy-oriented lessons on this issue. It is worth mentioning that these reflections are based on research carried out by, among others, the Instituto Amazónico de Investigaciones Científicas, SINCHI, la Fundación para la Conservación y el Desarrollo Sostenible, FCDS, and especially by el Centro de Alternativas al Desarrollo, CEALDES. They are also based on Sebastian's experience during years of research in the field. First, then, we should highlight the strategic value of the Northwestern Amazon as one of the 4 subregions of the Colombian Amazon, in accordance with the classification made by SINCHI in 2016. This classification takes into account the anthropogenic transformations that have occurred in the last 2 decades. So, on the one hand, the Northwestern Amazon is a historical zone of great geopolitical importance in the context of the Colombian conflict. For decades, it was not only the so-called strategic rearguard of the FARC, but it was also the space where major agrarian movements emerged in line with the expansion of the agricultural frontier, some internal colonization processes, and to a large extent with the Coca economy. On the other hand, the Northwestern Amazon constitutes an area of special ecological importance, comprising an area that goes from the Amazon Piedemonte in Caquetá and Putumayo to the south of Meta and the municipalities of Miraflores and San Jose in Guaviare. The Northwestern Amazon provides ecological corridors that enable connectivity between the Andean region, the Amazon biome, and the Orinoquia. For this reason, this zone plays a vital role in the flow of ecosystems, the development of critical habitats, and the mobility of multiple species. The confluence of both aspects places this subregion and its socio-environmental conflicts at the center of the construction of an environmental governance for peace in Colombia. In this regard, since 2016, the year of the signing of this agreement, deforestation has been accelerating as the main environmental problem in the Colombian Amazon. This region represents 52% of country's natural forest cover. However, according to IDEAM, in 2017, it accounted for 65% of the deforested area in Colombia. In absolute terms, it doubled the area affected by this phenomenon compared to 2016 and reached a peak of 144,000 hectares deforested in a year. In 2018, the trend was supposed to be reverted, although the region's share of the country's total grew to 70.1%. In 2019, this decreasing trend persisted, even though the region continued to concentrate the highest percentage of deforestation at a national level, the 62% of it. However, this improvement should be qualified. According to FCDS figures, the impacts of deforestation are unevenly distributed across the regions, and the Northern Amazon accounted for 89.6% of the total area deforested in the Colombian Amazon during the period between January and April 2020. The deceleration trend was thus reversed this period when there was a remarkable upturn in the dynamics of forest loss in the region, in this subregion. It went from almost 36,000 hectares in the first quarter of 2019 to near 64,000 hectares of lost forest in the same period of 2020. Means a year-on-year variation of 82.8%. In fact, as shown in this map published by IDEAM, the highest concentration of deforestation early warnings in Colombia is found in the northwestern Amazon. The persistence of old and new deforestation hotspots in this subregion constitutes a major challenge in the construction of a long-lasting territorial peace, as we will see, since such dynamics are inevitably associated with the fragilities of the peace-building process started with the peace agreement. However, although in the available literature, particularly the SINCHI, FCDS, and IDEAM reports, some other drivers are identified. We selected these three drivers, the ones that we consider the three most relevant to understand what is happening with deforestation in the northwestern Amazon, in line with the research conducted in field by CEALDES, and these are those drivers. First, the Coca economy. In 2017, Colombia reached the highest number of hectares of coca crops in its territory, about 172,000 hectares during this year. After this year, it began a gradual reduction until reaching around 150,000 hectares in 2019. In some places, the decrease meant transformations in the regional coca economy, notably related to families of leaf growers and harvesters who joined the PENIS, the program substitution. 29,902 families in the northwestern Amazon. However, since 2019, illegal armed groups, the GAOR, have begun to exert pressure for the replanting of up to double the number of hectares that were already substituted, as could be seen in some villages in the municipality of Puerto Concordia in the south of Meta. We also have observed that the value per gram of coca paste has increased from 2,000 to 2,200 pesos per gram to about 3,000 to 2,200 pesos per gram. Something that hasn't occurred at the national level since the 1990s. Finally, the slow implementation of the PENIS encourages renting and the reactivation of forest clearing. Second, the territorial grabbing. According to a study conducted by CEALDES in the Department of Guaviare, there has been a significant increase in the large agrarian properties, mainly since 2018. The businesses consist in increasing the value of land with forests through its destruction and the latter establishment of a productive system, or through the resale of the land. In this dynamic, the factors for speculation on the value of the land, roads, realignment, or infrastructure projects, and the arrival of potential investors are extremely influential. These investors are Araucanos, Casanareños, Huilenses, or Mexicanos, according to ethnographic information collected by CEALDES in Calamarbere in 2019. Although land is the main means of value accumulation in the region, the ongoing phenomenon also includes other goods. That's why the concept of territorial grabbing is proposed instead. Third, the cattle ranching. Despite not a new productive system in the region, cattle ranching has been experiencing, from 2017 onwards, some transformations on the way it is carried out in the region. Due to transformation in regional governance systems, investors who were previously seen as threats by the FARC are now entering in the area. These investors take live cattle to emerging zones where they are raised, and they establish some system of indebtedness where they are like almost the owners, the cattle workers in the regions. These investors remain far from being affected by the Artemisa plan operations, and they put pressure on deforestation to expand the fattening lots they pay security to the Gaors and generate an economy of indebtedness that ties these peasant families to an economy of dependence. As in this flow diagram, there are some additional elements that make possible the capture of rents by the actors involved in the production systems that trigger deforestation. First of all, there is the change in the role of the residual organized armed groups, the Gaor, since in the past, the FARC exercised a territorial control that had conservation effects on the forests. While the so-called dissident structures promote the transformation of these forests into productive systems that generate rents for them. In second place, as we can see, there is the scarcity of information on land registry and cadastral data that doesn't allow for assertive planning and monitoring of the region's properties. Furthermore, the low traceability of products makes it difficult to monitor them and diagnose their impacts on the forest. There is also an alliance between regional businessmen, local politics, and criminals that didn't exist before, or at least it wasn't that evident. And today is the perfect mechanism to promote deforestation. All of the above happens in the midst of vulnerable peasant families without any attention from the state, who, pressured by the regional economy and groups, become labor force and the perfect human shield against anti-deforestation operations. In this regard, many of the actors have experienced significant changes in the roles they played in socio-ecological region, in the socio-ecological relations in the sub-region during the period under analysis. The most important shifting moment is the signature of the peace agreement and the subsequent laying down of arms by the now extinct FARC guerrilla. The transformation in the role of actors allows inferring changes in forest governance that previously regulated the use and access to forest in the region. The following diagram shows a synthesis of the perception of actors weighted in different workshops with communities, local institutions, and academia. It is evaluated with 1 as a negative perception, 2 moderate, and 3 positive perception. The time ranges evaluated were 3 years before the signing of the peace agreement and 3 years after the signature of this agreement. Some of the most important transformations in roles of the actors were those of FARC, now GAOR, and the institution Parques Nacionales Naturales, both of which are downgraded to negative perception. The reason for this is, in the case of Parques, the perceived linkages at the local level with the Artemisa operations and their consequences on peasant human rights. And in the case of the FARC, GAOR, the significant changes in the territorial control strategies associated with growing alliances with some businessmen and landowners, and also because of the pressures on social organizations in the territory. Finally, we ask ourselves then, almost 5 years after the beginning of the implementation of the peace agreement, which are the lessons we have learned so far on deforestation? Well, first of all, the regional trajectory of the Northwestern Amazon allows us to underscore the thing. The Conference 4021 of December 2020, designed to address the problem of deforestation with a comprehensive and sustainability-oriented strategy, lacks of the enough depth and has serious weaknesses that limit its scope. Hence, if such a document lacks the required depth, despite being a synthesis of current institutional efforts, some lessons for reorienting public policy making may be the following. First, overcome the exclusively punitive approach of Operación Artemisa, the precarious results prosecuting the big deforesters show that large structures that drive the forest degradation remain intact, and it is important to improve the level of functional communication between legitimate actors as a strategy to build a long-term agreements within the legal framework. Second, in addition to the fragility of the mechanisms contemplated by the peace agreement, such as the pennies, there is also an ambivalence of conservation policies. For example, there is a collision between the Supreme Court sentence 4360 of 2018 and the Artemisa Plan. It is pertinent, therefore, to harmonize conservation approaches while returning to a path towards rigorous implementation of the peace agreements updated with environmental sustainability criteria. Third, two of the main drivers of deforestation urgently, those of cattle and the one of territorial grabbing, need to be met with concrete policies focused on the most critical aspects. On the one hand, it is essential to move forward as soon as possible with an exhaustive multi-purpose cadastre that deactivates speculation and territorial grabbing, and on the other hand, to encourage, in order to punish the economic aids involved in forest destruction, current efforts to encourage good agricultural practices must be complemented with the identification and implement of weak links in the traceability chain of products coming from areas with a high incidence of deforestation. And finally, as a pillar of strong forest governance, it is necessary to scale up projects financed with international cooperation funds, such as those related to Visión Amazonía. In other words, the impact of such projects may be increased by coordinating them with other local projects and cooperation programs, linking them to green investment portfolios, and above all, by supporting them with a reliable and robust public initiative that generates trust and legitimacy in the institutions amongst the local population. Joint efforts must be made side of legality to block the path of illegal and actors. By doing so, the valuable but insufficient efforts that today are reduced to a local scale will be projected towards the construction of a long-lasting and environmentally sustainable peace. This is it. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Simón, por esta presentación. Okay, ahora tenemos...
Thank you for your presentation. Now we have Gisela and Natalia.
Listo. ¿Están viendo mi presentación, por favor?
Sí.
Okay, I hope you can see my presentation. Can you tell me, please? Good morning, everyone. We are part of this Guadaparques collective group, the National Natural Parks in Colombia. We're going to tell you about the process to produce report to recognition of nature rights, the territory, social economic rights, and Guardaparques, the forest rangers. This group as victims of the armed conflict. This was submitted group of Justice, Truth, and Reparation. This presentation will be given by 3 delegates of this collective group. First is divided into 3 parts: description and scope of the report, challenges and structure, and finally is the juridical strategy that we have applied. To produce this report, we had a conceptual design where on the one hand, we analyze the victimizing deeds over nature on biodiversity at different scales, at the landscape level, ecosystems, communities, species, and in resources such as soil, water, and air. So we know that all the armed stakeholders have had an impact on biodiversity. And then that's how we worked. We also saw that the armed conflict had created impacts, of course, both on the people, of the cleric servants of natural parks, They were public servants, but they suffered these attacks or violations. We know that peasant communities, indigenous communities, and black communities, some of them overlapping their territories. They share these territories, and they're also in the national natural parks or protected areas. They've been victims of the armed conflict. This was an important situation. We had to define the victimizing deeds over the communities and the clerks or the officials of national natural parks and NP, and the damages caused on people psychologically or collectively. And in general terms, we wanted to say that when NNPs, National Natural Parks of Colombia, are being impacted, not only do they impact the parks, but also the communities and the officials, the NNP officials who are present there, but the whole nation is impacted because NNPs provide ecosystemic service that is essential to the development of cities, for the development of the rural territories, and in general terms, for the country. It should be important to say that why we submitted this report. Well, it's been 17 uh, NP officials that have been murdered. One of them is missing and one was exiled. I'd like to say something really important here. This report is submitted as a strategy that allows for the environmental defenders to be recognized by the JEP, the Special Peace Jurisdiction. And we talk about environmental defenders. We remember the communities, indigenous and social civility communities that are working for the environment, to protect the environment. And we believe each one of them, and we hope will be one of the big cases, they can also submit their own reports. We believe that's an important point. Now, why are we submitting the report? Another reason is that sometimes it seems like the NNP system is in isolation, and it turns out the territorial context where we see an abandonment of the rural territory from always in the public policies, but also notice these maps that we show here, this context of threats, forced displacement. You can see here the map of anti-personnel mines in our country, and it's in protected areas. I should say that protected areas have been incorporated since 60 years ago, but amidst war. And with UNILOL, we've been able to achieve these areas. You're going to see in these maps, some later maps, where we preserve, that's where they preserve, or where we preserve a lot of the biodiversity. Some challenges to our report, well, the conceptualization to understand what territory was, what is damage to the territory, what are the victimizing deeds, beyond law 1448 and beyond law 388, or all these laws that have been passed, or article 101 of the political constitution. That's why we define something such as social ecological territory that includes, of course, nature, but also it includes forest rangers of these territories, and of course also the territories of the communities that are, like we said, inhabiting these areas. We'd like to mention Juan Manuel Saogal from External University, who supported this project. He passed away this year. We'd like to thank him, and also Andes University for their support in the legal area, and of course the Sustainable Conservation Foundation. They also facilitated documents on the Amazon about victimizing deeds. We made progress, and an important point was how to define reparation measures for some that's not included in the law, and that was another important point. Now Libardo will continue. Thank you, Gisela. The report, I think his voice froze. It includes men, women, NNP, national natural parks, contractors. We have estimated that it's a very important value to all of them, all the civil society, which throughout these voluntary forest ranger programs, they have been part of our team, and with their work, everything they've done together with the NNP officials directly in the areas, they have contributed to the territory as well. Who are the other victims? Well, the social ecological territory, just as Gisela has mentioned. I mean, all the context, all the violations that take place in this territory, where we see the protected areas, where the protected areas
entramaje de ese sistema que finalmente es el que permite, digamos, que podamos tener un sistema territorial en el tiempo consolidado. Igualmente consideramos como víctima del conflicto armado a toda la naturaleza. Toda esa
nature is all victim. All those species, more than 97% of the wildlife species that are in the country, 97% of them are within this NMP system. And why not say more than 50% of all the frailejones in our country, these highland or high mountain plants. So this group of forest rangers, nature and all, they are victims, including in our report, victims of the armed conflict. Next one. The objectives stated by, or the report seeks to achieve, it's a collection, rigorous collection. It's construction throughout time of these 60 years that Gisela talked about. And for example, after the persistent conflict, it's even more valid. The objective of the report at first was to recognize nature as a victim of the armed conflict. Something that sounds absurd, but it's very telling. And we want to recover the memory of the national natural park system in the framework of the armed conflict. In spite of the fact that of all the time the system has been in place, many of the references of memoirs, I think, is the very first time that we do this rigorously. That was another purpose of the project, of this report, is to know the truth that was lived amidst war. There are many situations that are known in our country amidst the armed conflict, but it's very little what we know about the relation that the NMP system has lived, because of the endurance of the armed conflict, especially in the crucial territories of the country. And they're part of their rural areas. Another objective is to propose or suggest reparation measures at a different level. That's also another activity. We believe it's important. It goes from the consolidation of the groups of society and the value of natural resources and the structure of protected areas in our country and the importance it has to society. Another aspect is we wanted to turn into the voice of the non-humans, of the voice of ecosystems, the voice of rivers, wildlife that is there amidst conflict. Another very important aspect is to dignify the work of forest rangers. We took on this role throughout time, beyond being a job and means of living, and a livelihood for these people, and a way to build a country. Another one of the objectives that we set out to reach was to open the road. Gisela mentioned that, open the road for other defenders of the environment. We cannot be abstracted from the social economic reality and the conflict lived in our country. And finally, we report the victimizing deeds and the damage to nature. The richness of this report, which Giselle mentioned, is a very important contribution of the group of national natural parks and NP system for the search and towards the goal of our country, but also true peace. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm talking about the legal challenges to produce a report. One of them was the report to state the responsibility of the system to have the legal figures that are complex, and they are not in the Colombian legal system, but they are key to achieve our objective. It was mentioned before, the victimizing deed, to see that definition, for example, deforestation, legal economies, forests and or spills. These are not victimizing deeds, they're not considered so in the victim's law. We also produce questions or introduce questions how to promote the, to make sure the responsibility of protected areas or damages to protected areas is not responsibility of the NNP. The responsibility of management about a common thing such as the management of these parks. What is the concept of reparation and what we want to rescue from these activities and how and what we're going to repair. So when we try to look at this as a victim, we try to provide elements, even though it was not a final answer, how to approach these questions and take advantage of the legal resources that we had nationally and internationally. We felt they were useful to promote this in the system of justice, truth, and reparation. So all these questions have led us to the discussion of the view of environmental rights through transitional justice based on the relations and the own dynamics of this specific mission of parks and NP. So going back to the figure of the territory as a victim, we felt that this discussion would facilitate the activity or the responsibility of the system on environmental truth and justice. So this cannot be atomized. It means we cannot look at it separately, like kidnapping or theft, or separately, but truth and justice needs to be seen from a comprehensive viewpoint. Otherwise, the truth and the effect of the war on the parks may be forgotten. This is how, with these legal elements, we could call JEP's attention to analyze not only each case, but the context where all these crimes took place in these protected areas of NMPs, the National Natural Parks. We have two more elements. One, all the arguments at the national level and also internationally. At the national level, we see that the peace accords, point 14, incorporated as part of the negotiation the protection of protected areas, recovered the areas impacted by illegal crops, and this last one included explicitly national natural parks. There's not one single provision to regulate NMP because the territorial context where they are developed, especially protected areas in Colombia, is closely related to reality of the rural areas of the country and the social economic complex situations that for over 2 centuries have been the origin of our country. All this has is interlinked, so we have this mission as to look at this complexity, all these dynamics in the territories. So in this scenario, we also saw a valuable contribution from Andes University. All the jurisprudence that have recognized during multiple opportunities the interrelation of the territory as an important element in protecting the fundamental rights of citizens beyond the ethnical origin is one of the issues we want to rescue with this report, to recognize the dimensions and the relation between the territory and the peoples. I mean, this interrelation does not have an effect only on the conception of the territory itself, but also residual effects, how to be accredited before the system, because it provides elements how to integrate the suffered damage and how to obtain proper reparation. Those were two concepts on which there was not clarity in the national legal framework. We also took into account considerations from the international scenario, the international arena. On the one hand, the considerations from the limitations of transitional justice in environmental concerns, there's been a recognition there. It's been shown that transitional justice has only been good for a modest contribution to prevention of environmental abuse. The scope, its scope is limited. It needs to be combined with other initiatives for peace building and long term, and the four main inventions associated to transitional justice, I mean responsibility, search of truth, reparation, reforms in the health sector, and so on, have rarely been committed to relevant topics for natural resources. For example, important or more specific violations on political or civil rights. However, at the international level, we have the situation, there's a significant base in the international principles that involve duties and respectives international humanitarian law. I'm sorry, she's reading too fast. And something promoted by the International Red Cross on armed conflict and the environment that was passed last year in 2020. It also talks about shared responsibility of the different stakeholders. And then ICRC intends to increase awareness on international humanitarian law to the extent that the parts of the conflict limit the damage and are responsible for the damage to nature. Finally, international efforts around the need to build and consolidate the concept of human safety and environmental safety as a key part of human safety. These were considerations that we took into account, and we wanted to include them in the report to have a more holistic view, and the idea to recognize nature, forest rangers, and the territories as victims of the armed conflict. All these discussions, of course, are included in the report, but not as loose pieces, but they are in vogue and they are in discussion. It's a historical moment in this system to promote further discussion and find partners that will help us uh, achieve what we want to achieve with this comprehensive system. I don't know what's happening with my presentation. It's moving and moving. There's one more slide that I'd like to share. We have two videos to share to show the work we're doing, the initiative, the report, so that is submitted in the discussion scenarios, what is happening. So I'm gonna share it with you later. I'm sorry, Natalia. Please stop sharing and I can share this slide, okay? Okay, I'm gonna share it now. This is two videos to promote the work that we are promoted, that we have conducted, I'm sorry, and all the strategy. I hope it'll go beyond the report itself so that everyone who's interested in these topics, they may share this and watch them, the discussions and areas. And finally, we have an email where you can write to us with all your doubts and comments about the work that we're conducting and the topics included in the report. I'm sorry that I went so fast and so technical. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos, que eso
Thank you,
fue súper
everyone.
interesante.
It
Bueno,
was very interesting. Okay, now we have the last presentation by Valentina and Kimberly. And then after that, we'll have a QA session. Kimberly and Valentina. Yes, I'm beginning to share my screen. Please confirm if you can see it. Yes, we can see it. Well, good afternoon to everyone. This is Valentina and Kimberly. We are anthropology students at Antioquia University. The presentation we'd like to share with you is the result of some research paper within a seminar that's something called Environment and Post-Conflict. It's one of the subjects of our program. We're gonna be showing the objectives and what we wanted to achieve. First of all, more than historic analysis, the work intends to create strategies and work proposals for the future within 10 years so that we can mitigate the environmental conflict of deforestation in this national natural reserve called NUCAC. One point to keep in mind, this work was conducted at the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020, so the data we'll be sharing are framed in that period of time. They might have changed a little bit, just for us to keep that in mind. Can you move? Okay. During the research process, we saw the need to have a historical approach of the deforestation in Guaviare. And we realized that to be able to understand deforestation, we had to understand how it began in territory. It was not something recent, but it had been there for a long time. And we understood that deforestation has many variables and many stakeholders, at least throughout time, because of, for the sake of time of this presentation, we're not going to delve in each aspect, but let's say that it has three main axes. That is, before declaring the territory as a national reserve, what was happening with the deforestation after the declaration in 89, and if the agreement, what is happening now. When we identified the stakeholders and the activities, this was related to the first presentation. The main activities related to deforestation are listed here, especially the extension or the use of these lands for livestock or cattle ranching, the creation or the opening of new roads, not only impact Guaviare, but the whole Amazon region. Colonization that has taken place been driven by the activities such as cattle raising and illegal crops. Land grabbing by colonists for different activities, palm oil crops, and also livestock breeding. Like we said, illegal crops mainly near the Nira River and near the reservation of the Nuca community. Of course, wood extraction and African palm crops. These industries have become more intensive in the last years, and the main actors, the main key holders, those who practice these activities, though have been violated, have been vulnerable, they're impacted by these activities. So we have local governments, business owners, there are groups from the old FARC throughout the territory, indigenous communities and colonies, peasants, farmers, CARs, the regional autonomous corporations that are the environmental authorities, and illegal outlaw groups, both national and international. They have been identified, for example, Sinaloa cartel and different cartels, drug cartels that even after the signing of the peace accords, they increase violence in the territory because they want to exercise control over the illegal crops. Now, when we look at the deforestation within natural reserves, we need to understand that at the beginning, it was an area of 890,782.98 hectares. For the year 2018, it was decreased to 887,752.54 hectares, according to EDM. Since 1990 to 2018, deforestation of the natural reserve rivers has impacted over 18,000 hectares, and only 0.2% has been, let's say, corrected or reforested. This is again information from IDEAM between 2018 and 2018, April 2018 and March 2019. About 900 hectares were deforested within the reservation, the Nukak reservation. And for 2020, it's been reported, again, this is data from last year, 437.2 hectares and more than 20 forest fires. Now you can move on. It was important to us. We are anthropologists, and that's what we're studying, not only to understand the environmental social conflict and to understand the reasons, the communities that are involved there, to see who the stakeholders are and who starts the conflict and who the victims are of what was happening there in the territory. So like I said before, we found land grabbing as one of the drivers. Is a historical activity that's taking place in that department, that state. Many people come to a territory escaping from violence. We also have the construction of legal and illegal roads, the change in the land use. At the beginning, there were some activities that were less intense. I'm talking about crops, but also with the arrival of cocaine crops, then coca crops, there was a change in land use. Also, the greater ranching or cattle ranching projects. Also, these impacted the water sources, and there was a lot of displacement because of the armed conflict. So what we did, it was precisely to be able to see what legislation could contribute to the territory. Speaking of the environment, and we took the peace accords as an opportunity to make changes and transformation at the territorial level and at the community level. So this is how we conducted analysis, and we prioritized some points and some specific actions that could help the issue of deforestation. The first point was the comprehensive rural reform as a point of the Colombian rural transformation. And for environmental protection, we prioritized some points, was prioritization of PDETs, the development plans with territorial focus. We kept that in mind for the strategies that we'll be presenting later. And speaking of the progress, we consolidated till the beginning of 2020 the PDT in Guaviare Meta. There were 72 works to June 2020, and they projected some land titling or property deeds to 87 pieces of land. Now, the end of the conflict. The idea was to see the end of the armed conflict, the cease of fire, and the incorporation of these fighters to civil society, and some 20 areas that were established, 7 transitory points within these territories. They were being consolidated there, that we call PNT, I'm sorry, PTN, and but it was not for sure that they were sustainable. Now, the third point was the solution to illegal drugs, because we needed a comprehensive approach, perspective of public health, and a perspective from the territory. We wanted to see what programs would be consolidating there at the national level to replace illegal crops, and the creation of community comprehensive plans to replace illegal crops. Well, the progress achieved there, they were building this program, or the PNIS. It's a program to replace illegal crops, but it was only a reduction of 28% of coca crops. So speaking of the multi-purpose canister, we felt it's a cross-cutting factor because it allows identifying lands and its registration so that public policy may be created and suggested and proposed. And this will facilitate solve the conflicts on the use of land and reduce migration or displacement, and be able being able to have access to funds for productive projects. These were some of the prioritized actions. With the Mussipiel Pact for Regional Transformation, it was a document built together where communities created or decided to make contributions. It's a common element because it allows the creation of other strategies in the territory. We conducted an analysis. What could be done to reduce reduction by 2020 to reduce deforestation there. So we have three parts, three phases. The first one from 2020 to 2024, what we can do to reduce deforestation there. It matches the end of the municipal administrations with the idea is to begin to manage and exercise pressure there to give training as well and talk about the projects and this project as such. The second phase is from 2025 to 2027. That is the training and the first steps in the constellation of projects, for example, productive projects, which we might explain later. And then finally, 2028 to 2030 is the implementation, the total implementation of the strategies. We began to prioritize the actions, just as stated in the development plans, the community development plans, and found in different participatory documents, but also legal documents that would allow for the reduction of deforestation in this reservation. As such, we prioritize two actions. The first one is reduction of cattle ranching within the reservation because we found that precisely the introduction of cattle and the land grabbing for a to use these lands as livestock areas is what has caused deforestation there in this reservation. So we need to come up with strategy to reduce and to create strategies to uh, reforestation and adaptation of lands and also to reduce. And the final projection is that the communities will not depend economically on livestock, or at least not only. We know that's a slow, gradual process. So we prioritize some agricultural activities, uh, forestry activities that allow approaching livestock or cattle ranching from another angle to avoid expansion of the agricultural frontier, and other proposals that we received from the community, such as expanding to other peasant farmers, agricultural centers, and the home gardens, green production, all of which will enable the territory to be inhabited and used for other economies without using livestock. Okay, just as Kimberly explained, we wanted to prioritize these two strategies. This one has to do with environmental conservation. When we did the work, we understood that the management and all the implementation of structural changes that we could conceive to replace cattle ranching is not something that takes place overnight. And not only does it include the people directly related to it, but it involves all the inhabitants of the region, the department, and the reservation. So we need to come up with other strategies that at the same time try to implement the first or the former. They look for the preservation of the primary forest, the forest that has not been touched, and also the recovery of the soils and the recovery and reforestation of areas that have been impacted. So we based on FTR, some regional pacts, and we asked people how they could contribute to environmental conservation in this transformation. The first one is the first call is to delimit the reservation visibly. The first warning that we found there was not a clear boundary of the reservation. People sometimes they don't know that they are within a protected area. That's the first call. That's one of the strategies that we want to approach first. So bordering, the limitation of the borders of frontiers, and come up with the strategies for alternate crops. Also improve the environmental culture, payment for environmental services, so that the communities may participate in these projects, or they could serve as forest rangers, reforesters, and others, which will engage the community and let them work with the environment and nature, and they may find a way to make a living, and they can transition to other economic activities. Also, of course, the construction of sectorial tables amongst the different institutions and do community work. Okay, and finally, here we show some results, the expected results, and also the lessons learned from this research paper. First of all, it's very hard for livestock to disappear. It's a very slow and gradual process, but that's the ultimate goal. But at least, and if not that, at least to stop the expansion of the agricultural frontier. That's what we want to do, minimize the impact of the livestock activity and other related activities within the reservation and within the protected area. And we want to provide alternatives so that people can make a living and they can find a way to make a living. At the same time, to carry out other actions to consolidate territorial projects or even access to land for those who, as a matter of fact, and historically speaking, have suffered these issues of the lack of access to land, and then have an approach on human rights and focus on productive processes, and they can manage their own resources so the communities may be autonomous. That's it. Thank you. We want to thank Kimberly and Valentina and all the lecturers. It was very nice. We have very little time left. I guess it'd be nice if the audience can contact the panelists. And so we're going to take questions from the audience. You can raise your hand. And I can see two people have raised their hands. I'll be letting you have the floor. Fine, let's start with Jorge. Jorge, you have the floor. Well, good morning. About the last talk, I just wanted to ask how you control the erosion of rivers. Are we gonna have a question round and then we answer, or we answer one at a time? Because I think there might be several questions to us. So we could group them. Did you hear the question? Yes, we heard the question. I did. Okay, thank you. Okay, yes, let's answer the question one at a time while they can organize the questions they have received. Okay, yes, there are several processes to be able to treat the basins, and that's when we talk about restoration processes. Not only reforestation, the idea is not just to plant trees, but there'll be actions where we need to do works, civil works sometimes, but also we talk about restoration, passive restoration, which may be developed, and we need to take into account the features of the ecosystems that are present there, what the species are, endemic species to the sites, so that processes may be developed. We also have the care process, is not just a specific action, it's a whole process that needs to be carried out. So we have these CARs, the regional autonomous corporations, the main regional environmental authority. They have that mission, and they could consider those actions. The next thing is how we have the territorial occupation models. When we invade some river basins, we create more risk, and that's where the works are kind of lost. I think those are some of the actions that are the actions that need to be taken into account. Thank you. Your mic is off, but you probably can write the question in the chat. The mic is off. Victor, go ahead. You can ask your question. Okay, thank you. Warm greetings from El Capricho in Guaviare. It's a municipality. My question, you had a question, yes. Yes. Can you hear me now? Yes, we do. Okay, great. Why is it so hard for the local initiatives that want, they say they are peasant organizations or community organizations, at the first front, in front of all these degradation, deforestation? Why is it so hard to have local recognition? And I'm saying this because I'm saying locally because the international support or national support, they come from the center of the country, and but they go to the territorial institutions, the governor's office, the mayor's office, and it's so hard to get support for the communities. We are in the territory. We want to take that step. We want to protect. We want to participate and find solutions to issues. We don't have that voice. No one listens to us. We send letters, and the environmental authority does not even respond, does not even answer. So I'd like to ask, from your perspective, what is the problem? What is a, I don't know, lack of connection? What are we missing so that the front line, the communities, those of us who are suffering and trying to help at the same time, we may be heard and we may participate in these processes? Thank you. Yes, raise your hand so you know who wants to speak, the panelists as well. Okay. I don't know where you raise your hand. There's a blue hand in the bottom right. You don't see it? Okay, go ahead. No, I don't see it. Okay. About Victor's question, I've noticed that the experience, I'm sorry, we have had some issues with the microphone or the camera. Let's see the questions again from the chat. Is that okay? I'm sorry, Christine. We are answering a question that Victor asked. Sebastian was trying to answer, and I'd like to follow up. Okay, great. Our experience in the field has been that most international projects have a predetermined channel or some intermediary, some middleman for their operation. So the third or fourth piece of the chain is always the local communities. So from that viewpoint, I agree with the spirit of the question. I think one of the ways how we can change that, we can break that circle or that intermediation of international funds, well, maybe three things. First, the outreach of communities, how communities can access to this kind of debate, and some of them are already doing. I think there we come some. No, we have some coming events, and members of the communities are going to be participating. One second thing is that we need to keep in mind this instance between the where the funds come from and the places where they operate. So initiatives such as the Movement for Peace, they wanted to finance directly some organizations so that they would execute the resources. And of course, a third thing that is also important is to report the ways the resources are operated, because a great deal of the funds are just administrative budget expenses, and very little is actually invested in the communities. I think those three options can help. They're useful. It's a proposal, and the proposal from the sponsors is to finance directly the projects of communities. To answer Victor's question, that's an important question. And you asked, why is that happening? I have 5 points to touch on. I hope you can hear me, because I see some of you say you cannot hear me. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. The first thing is the work scales. When there's a public policy and there's a national scale, when it comes down to the municipality, it's a little thing. So when they land it from the national, it's a whole interesting process. So data is not always updated. We know the community has more accurate data because they live in the territory, but that's one thing, one reason. The top-down initiative. Another point is the lack of coordination between institutions to execute resources. So sometimes it seems like we are competing to see who wins, and we, in the end, we disperse the intervention, and this creates less impact, less of an impact. The next thing that happens many times, there are local organization processes that are not solid. They also disperse just as the initiative. So the problem is both sides, and there's an important situation, and it's the capacity we get to get there. Sometimes we want to get to each village, and yes, the whole team of institution, it could be 4 people, 5 people. How can you do that? You cannot get to each uh, village. And I believe that we need to agree. We need to find a way to make sure we are a team. It's not the community team or the institutional team or the academia or the sponsor or the national corporation. It has to be a common intent to have political will, because we all like, I've always said this, we like to point out to others, but we don't see what we are doing individually to contribute or to hinder. Thank you. Very nice. Someone else has raised their hand, and then we'll go back to the Q&A. Maria? Now, you can switch on your mic. Okay, can you hear me? I'm in Switzerland. I'm Colombian. I want to thank you for this interesting insights, very interesting reflections, very relevant. I have a question for about the first presentation from Simon. He talked about the industries, some industries. He mentions those industries as some of the drivers of deforestation, but I'd like him to be more specific and mention what kind of industries, what kind of businesses are involved in this land grabbing. And especially, I'd like to know if the palm oil crops, oil, oil palm crops are included there, and what the trend there, what trend is the trend? What is the trend there in that area? Thank you. Sorry, it was too much noise. Yes, Simon, go ahead. Can you answer the question? I don't know if Sebastian was going to answer the question. He's not in the connection. He was going to answer the question. There he is. I'm sorry. I was my I lost the connection. Yes, there have been some dispersed reports. For example, in 2018, there was an article that mentioned some companies that had projects there for industrial projects like the palm industry. We've seen that the palm crops, at least in this region, after conducting the data analysis, is not a determining factor in these towns, Puerto Concordia, for example, but they have witnessed much rapid transformation and other projects at the end of the 90s and beginnings of 2000 in these towns, Mapiripi and Puerto Concordia. The forest was replaced by oil palm. More recently, the phenomenon is land grabbing. And this is related to meat production, to cattle ranching. There are some initiatives, and very soon there will be publications of research papers, and they mention business groups, even food supply chains, and related to the deforestation issue. I mentioned this because the studies will be released shortly, but the truth is that it's been discussed by a French organization. They've shown some early reports of a case in Brazil about the link with this group with different elements that they sell, and they're linked to deforestation, especially in that country. Here in Colombia, it's very difficult to trace the zones and the products that come from deforested areas, and there's no doubt there's a link there that should be proven. And some surface or the wholesalers that have linkages to these deforested areas. Okay, we have a question for Kimberly and Valentina. Can you mention some of the proposals with PDTs in Guaviare? The development plan with territorial approach. The strategies that we created based on the PDTs. What we did was to analyze those plans, development plans, and the pacts for the region, see what proposals matched the proposals from the communities, and look at the documents, and then bring them together as a strategy. So they are based on the PDETs, and they are related to you, to Meta Guaviare. And we can answer those, mention those that we included. Oh, go ahead. There was another question about the governance scenarios, and another question before about access to information, the obstacles or the barriers to have access to information. I believe it's very complex. We, as independent members, we began to look for the databases and the data as such on deforestation in Colombia, but also in Guaviare specifically. It was a whole challenge. We had to analyze who owns the information and who has collected the information. Because at the moment when we analyzed it, there were many business owners, many companies and politicians that are involved, even with some reports because of the deforestation. So that the obstacles are even greater, not only for us researchers, but also for the people who are there in the territories, who work there, and they like to have access to data and information, and the communities themselves. I think the participation scenarios, well, I think it's necessary to strengthen those that are right there, That's why we mentioned the peasant associations, the livestock associations, autonomous regional corporations, those that are working in the territory. The process have democratic participations to build the PDETs and other documents, especially after the signing of the peace accord. So I think we need to strengthen those that are there and begin to work based on those to have territorial actions, especially if they are contextualized. And a follow up, let's say this is based on the request from the communities. For example, create tables where communities are present and institutions are present. In the case of Guaviare, there are some safety issues. So a physical space has been difficult for people to meet, to get together and consolidate tables more clearly, but the work is being done. So we request institutional support so that the tables begin to work with what they have and they continue to grow. One more question for Sebastian. Hello? Can you talk more about the Artemis operation and its actions? You said that some investors are not within their scope. Yes, we mentioned that. Can you hear me? We mentioned Artemisa precisely because a great deal of the operations have focused on this area of analysis. They have seized or they have, it has legal and criminal consequences, especially for workers of these farms, not directly for the owners of the investment, not, but it hasn't touched those who are behind the land grabbing business. So this has impacted peasant communities and workers of the farms. Of course, there are some cases that have been shown people with very high income statements, but that has happened since the last quarter. Before that, we saw that the biggest report of operations were for people who worked there different ways in this deforestation process or the deforestation chain, but they were not the cause of it. And one of the elements that are missing in the Artemis operation is that the reports of recovered areas correspond to the intervened lands, but this does not guarantee that the forest will be recovered. It's a military intervention. So it doesn't mean that these lands are going to be reforested. It just belongs to the land. The land belongs to the country. But this deforestation process has impacted many more areas, many more people. We still have a lot of flaws, especially the conflict when implementing, for example, sentence 4360. In some regions, we heard about sentences and they said that the operations were justified through a sentence. It was a mandate and it did not um, let's say, really order the police intervention. There has been a lot of conflict. That's the point, and the communities feel distant from the actions of the state. Okay, this has been very interesting morning, and we are going to take 1 hour for lunch. And after that, we'll resume with other presentations. And after the presentations in the afternoon, we will have a poster session. So I invite everyone so that you join us in the poster presentation. It's in Remo, in a different platform, and then you can walk around, you can talk to other people, you can interact. It's very interactive and it's really cool. So I hope that everyone can participate. We want to know if maybe we can answer one or two questions that are there in the chat. One of the concerns we saw has to do with, I think, Mariel Pilar, as to who forest rangers are. We mentioned that quickly in the presentation. Forest rangers are women and men most of the time who have a peasant or farmer background. NMP, National Natural Park System, it's not an official policy, but they have established these areas as a space not only for preparation and training of young people and adults. Almost all of the activities that are conducted in favor of these protected areas are not favoring not only the populations who live there, who are in the protected areas and the surroundings, but many of those young people and adults end up being part of the work teams. I mean, national natural parks and protected areas, very strictly, they are an instance and a proposal to give labor options to peasants, to farmers. All of us who have been at protected areas, we have a lot of peasant background, farmers background, indigenous background, African Colombian backgrounds, and I think that's one of the advantages of NNP. And I'm not saying this uh, in a displeasing manner, but we have had the chance uh, to see those who have been logging or they have been hunters, but then they join the NMP system. They have a very strong knowledge, very wide knowledge, not only about the ecosystem, but how the ecosystem works, and they change their minds and they begin to protect. So here, and based on the question from Mariel Pilar, I believe, we do not only limit ourselves to what uh, let's say a payroll means list of people who preserve and protect the area, but we go much further. We go beyond. We provide many more services in these areas. It's a way to improve the local GDP. It might not be with a lot of resources, but in the end, there are some flow. There is some flow of resources. There are some resources flowing, and of course, it's a very strong influence because based on that, even many of us who have been to college, we and get enriched by that and we learn from them, from the forest rangers. So forest rangers, it's everyone, regardless of our condition. That's how we believe ourselves to be, and that's how we deem these people. Thank you. I'm sorry, we are out of time. We don't have more time.